Title of this lesson is How to Incorporate Quotations. The purpose of this lesson is to teach your students the skill of properly incorporating textual evidence from various texts into their writing. This lesson falls in week 4 of the first 9 weeks. It's really important that your students have read and been exposed to the Looking Glass Wars before this lesson is taught, because all of these quotations and characters and all that information comes directly from the Looking Glass Wars, and so their understanding of this lesson will be much better if they've already read a good portion of the Looking Glass Wars. So you can see in your first 9 weeks big picture that your lesson is right here, how to incorporate quotations on these 2 days. The first 3 weeks, there's been some time spent on reading and discussing the Looking Glass War. So that's really important leading up to this lesson. So one of the reasons, or the main reason really, that this lesson is introduced so early in the school year is that this is such an essential skill that we wanted to introduce this early and have students continue to practice and work on this skill all throughout the year. This is a skill that will follow them all throughout high school in not only selecting good textual evidence, but learning how to properly incorporate that into their writing. It's just so essential that we want to focus on that a good bit. So when you get your modules and when you have access to Canvas, this is what the lesson will look like. When you open it up in Canvas, you have a little bit of information about the lesson, the materials that will be needed, and then you'll see that this lesson is really broken up into 2 parts. Activity 1, you're really going over information with them and showing them how to incorporate those quotations, why it's important, what do you do with the punctuation, all of that information that's really essential to being able to perform this skill well. So you can have students take notes. You will be provided the PowerPoint. Those notes are already made for you. I would highly recommend having your students take those notes and use that information, because that's something they can refer to all throughout the year. The second part is actually a carousel activity where the students will get up, and that's where they will apply and practice integrating those quotations. And so this is a great opportunity to incorporate movement, which is one of our Marzano elements, which we know helps increase the learning and increases the skills. And so that is a great opportunity to incorporate movement into your classroom here with activity 2, where students will complete that carousel and apply that information. So moving on down through your lesson in Canvas, this is really just a summary of the information that is in the PowerPoint that's already provided for you. It gives a definition of what a quotation is, an explanation of why they need to introduce it, what a dropped quote is. And this information is super important. Right here in the middle, it talks about your acronym TIE. When I taught 8th grade and I had my 8th grade classroom, this was my bulletin board in the very front of the room where my desks face, where my students' desks face. I had this on a bulletin board, and we referred to it all year, that you tie your quote, you tag your quote, you introduce it or embed it. So that's like the meat of this lesson, is learning how to incorporate those quotes using what we call the tie method. And you have some examples here. Talk about dialogue, how to punctuate dialogue, how to work with quotations and quotation marks and commas. And so you can see there's a good bit to this. This is not something that students will master right out of the gate, especially with quotation marks and punctuations and commas and things like that. So we want to introduce this early in the year and continue building upon this skill. Also, at the end of this lesson, there is a great resource here that I would provide for my students. It's citing sources used in your paper, and it's the ELA requirements. And so you can give this to your students, and they can always refer to that. I would definitely point this out and talk to them about this and why it's important. But this is a really good resource, not only for you, but for your students. So when you are moving through Canvas for our training purposes, when you click on the link that says the Pear Deck presentation, this is what that will look like, okay? So what you guys will do, you will work through this Pear Deck at your own pace, and what is great about this is that you're going to be able to use this with your students, okay? You'll be able to use this resource with your students. So the beginning of this Pear Deck is the PowerPoint that you will show your students. So it's going to talk through what is a quotation. So if you were going to have them take notes, this is what you would show, okay? So what is a quotation? Why do you need to integrate quotations? And then you can see that it gives an example of a dropped quote using a quote from Looking Glass Wars. So you have Jack of Diamonds is characterized as an obnoxious, bullying, spoiled child. You have the quote here, and it is dropped. There is no tagging, introducing, or embedding. So you would show that to students. That's the incorrect version. This is where you will introduce your students to the tie method. You tag, introduce, or embed that quote. You have three options. You have an example of tagging the quote, where you have your information here. The narrator reveals, it comes after your quote. You can introduce your quote. The narrator recounts. That is where that little tagline there comes before your quote. And then finally, you could embed your quote. And that is where you have a combination of your words and the quote. This is what we want to encourage our students to strive for, is embedding their quotes. That's the best and most sophisticated way to introduce those quotes or to embed those quotes within their writing. And so we want to challenge them to embed their quotes eventually if they're not comfortable with that to begin with. So, for example, if you heard someone reading aloud this paragraph, could you distinguish the quoted portions from the writer's words? Which method sounds best? Tagged, introduced, or embedded? So you'll read this quote and you'll decide which way sounds best, tagged, introduced, or embed, and you'll choose your answer. You'll work through the dialogue portion. What is dialogue? How do you punctuate it? Why do you have to punctuate it differently, etc.? How do you tie dialogue quotations? Which one is most effective? So you'll choose your answer there. And this is what I referred to earlier, is when we're teaching students to properly incorporate their writing, we do want to encourage them to embed their quotations often. That is the best way and most sophisticated way, and we want to encourage them to do that. You have some information about punctuating quotation marks, question marks, exclamation marks, and then your end punctuation, okay? Talks about ellipses a little bit here. And then finally, the practice. So for our training purposes, we're using a Pear Deck to practice. But when you do this in your classroom, this is where you will want to incorporate the carousel, and you'll have the big chart paper and you'll have the quotations up, and you'll group your students and you'll work through that carousel, and they will practice tagging, introducing, and embedding all of these quotes. So for example, you would read this quote. Even in her pouts, he thought his daughter a delightful creature. So we want you to practice tagging this quote. So you would type your answer here. And then once you type your answer, the next slide will show you a possible answer. Okay? So you'll work your way through this Pear Deck, practicing, tagging, introducing, and embedding these quotes. This is a very important skill for your students to learn early on in the school year, as they will continue to use this skill all throughout high school. Once again, if you guys have any questions about anything, or if we can help in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out.